The cottonwood's ancient shadow stretched across the creek like a promise when Sarah Littlefeather first saw the blood, fresh crimson against weathered stone, still wet despite the desert's thirst. Her children froze behind her Joseph's protective hand, finding Mary's shoulder while their mother knelt beside the trail that led deeper into the thorny mesquite. "Mama." Mary's voice barely disturbed the afternoon stillness. Sarah raised her hand for silence. 40 winters had taught her to read the desert's warnings, and today it spoke of violence. The blood trail meandered toward the creek where cottonwoods grew thick, their leaves whispering secrets in the warm wind. She should turn back, should take her children home to their adobe shelter, should remember what happened to those who interfered with white men's troubles. But the healer's blood in her veins ran older than fear, older than the hard lessons of survival. The Creator had placed her here. Today. Now. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Sarah followed the blood trail through the mesquite thicket, her worn moccasins silent on the sandy earth. Joseph stayed close, one hand on the knife at his belt, his father's knife, too large for his 12-year-old frame, but carried with fierce pride. Mary clung to her brother's shirt, her gathering basket forgotten. The trail led to the largest cottonwood, its trunk thick as 3 men standing together. There, half hidden in the exposed roots, lay a man. Sarah's breath caught. His fine wool vest, the color of winter storm clouds, was torn and darkened with blood. A gold watch chain glinted against the fabric. His face, weathered but clean-shaven, bore the pallor of death approaching. Gray touched his temples where his hat had fallen away. "Is he dead, Mama?" Mary whispered. Sarah knelt beside him, her fingers finding the pulse at his throat, weak but steady, like a distant drum. The wound along his rib still seeped, though the bleeding had slowed, no bullet hole that she could see, perhaps a graze, perhaps a blade. His breathing came shallow but regular. "He lives," she said, examining his hands. Soft palms, neat nails. A rancher who gave orders, not one who worked the land himself. The tooled leather holster at his hip held a Colt .45 unfired and still secured. Joseph had moved to where a horse stood in the shade, reins tangled in a creosote bush. The boy studied the saddle, running his fingers over the burned leather brand. His face went still with recognition. "Mama." His voice carried weight beyond his years. "It's the McBride brand. This is Thomas McBride." Sarah knew that name. Every native family in the territory knew it. McBride owned more land than some entire tribes had left. His ranch bordered their community's holdings to the east. Not cruel like some, but distant as the mountains. A man who lived alone in his big house, they said, with no wife or children to soften his edges. "We should go," Joseph said, but his eyes stayed on the wounded man. "If someone did this to him." "The Creator doesn't ask if a wounded man deserves healing." Sarah interrupted, her voice carrying the authority of generations of medicine women. "Help me turn him. Gently now." She had sworn to heal. That oath knew no color, no boundary, no distinction between friend and stranger. Today, the desert had brought Thomas McBride to her threshold. She would not turn away. The decision made, Sarah moved with practiced efficiency. She untied the muslin water bag from McBride's saddle and dampened a piece torn from her underskirt. The blood came away to reveal a long gash along his ribs, not deep enough to kill quickly, but certain death if infection set in under this desert sun. "Joseph, bring the horse closer. We'll need to make a travois." She pressed the cloth against the wound, noting how McBride stirred slightly at her touch. "Mary, run home. Tell grandmother's spirit we're bringing someone who needs the old medicine." Mary hesitated. "But Mama, the white men." "Go, child. Prepare the lean-to room. Sweep it clean and lay out the good blanket, the one from your grandfather's army days." As Mary's small feet pattered away through the brush, Joseph worked beside his mother. Together they fashioned a travois from cottonwood branches and McBride's own saddle blanket. The boy showed strength beyond his years, understanding without being told where to support the wounded man's weight. "Why help him, Mama?" Joseph asked as they carefully shifted McBride onto the makeshift carrier. "His kind took Papa's life defending our water. They take and take until we have nothing left." Sarah paused, her hand still cradling McBride's head. Her son deserved truth. "Your father died defending what was ours by right and law. But this man—" She looked at McBride's unconscious face, seeing pain etched in the lines around his eyes. "This man bleeds the same red as we do. The hatred that killed your father, Joseph. It grows when we feed it. Today, we choose not to feed it." The journey back to their adobe dwelling took most of an hour. Joseph led the horse carefully while Sarah walked beside the travois, steadying it over rough ground. McBride moaned twice but didn't wake. His color grew worse, gray as old ash. Their home sat where the desert began its rise toward the distant mesas, 3 rooms of adobe brick with a lean-to addition, a small corral, and a garden patch where Sarah coaxed corn and beans from the reluctant earth. Mary waited in the doorway, having already prepared the sick room as instructed. "The medicine bundle. Mary, bring it." Sarah and Joseph transferred McBride to the horsehair mattress, his weight seeming to grow with each step. "And water. Much water. This man has lost blood enough to water the desert." As her children obeyed, Sarah studied her patient in the better light of the room. The ambush for ambush it surely was, had been carefully planned. Someone wanted Thomas McBride dead, but made to look like Apache raiders or bandits. Yet his gun remained unfired, his money pouch untouched. She began cutting away his ruined vest and shirt, exposing skin pale as winter moon above sun-darkened hands and face. Whatever brought Thomas McBride to their creek today, it wasn't chance. The spirits had woven this thread. Now Sarah must decide how to weave it into the pattern of their lives. Sarah opened the medicine bundle with reverence, unwrapping the soft deer hide that had protected these remedies for 5 generations. Each small pouch and wrapped packet held its own power willow bark for fever, sage for cleansing, yarrow for blood stanching, prickly pear pulp for drawing infection. Her grandmother's stone mortar sat at the bundle's heart, worn smooth by countless hands, grinding healing into being. "Mary, keep the water coming. Joseph, you'll help me hold him when the fever comes." She worked as her grandmother had taught her, as her grandmother's grandmother had taught before that. The willow bark went into the mortar first, ground fine as dust. Then sage, its sharp scent filling the small room. The coal oil lamp flickered as she worked, casting her shadow large against the adobe walls, making her movement seem like an ancient dance. "What are those words, Mama?" Mary asked, standing in the doorway with another water jug. "Healing songs from the old time. They help the medicine find its path to the sickness." Sarah's voice rose and fell in the rhythm passed down through generations. Words that predated the Spanish, the Mexicans, even the memory of when her people first came to this land. She mixed the ground herbs with clean water and a touch of corn pollen, sacred, blessed, a bridge between earth and sky. The poultice, when ready, smelled of earth and growing things, of life persisting despite all hardship. Thomas McBride stirred as she applied it to his wound. His eyes moved beneath closed lids, and words began spilling from his cracked lips. "The papers. Courthouse." His head turned restlessly. "Hancock, you bastard. Burning the records won't. The copies." Sarah's hands stilled. Joseph leaned closer, listening intently. "They're killing me for the land deeds," McBride muttered, clearer now in his delirium. "Federal survey. Proves the Little Feather claim. Proves them all." Sarah and Joseph exchanged glances. Their family name on this stranger's fevered lips felt like destiny speaking. "Papa knew," Joseph whispered. "He said the courthouse fire 2 years ago wasn't accident." McBride's fever climbed as darkness deepened outside. His skin burned beneath Sarah's touch, and the careful poultices seemed to evaporate as quickly as she applied them. She had seen men die of such fevers, strong men who fought until their strength gave out. "Children, you should sleep." "We stay," Joseph said firmly, taking his place at McBride's feet to hold him still when the shaking came. Through the first watch of night, McBride thrashed and called out names some Sarah recognized as prominent ranchers, others unknown. Once he sat straight up, eyes wide but seeing nothing, and spoke clear as day. "Father, I've failed you. The land means nothing without honor." Then he collapsed back, weaker than before. Sarah sang the old songs continuously now, her voice growing hoarse. She alternated poultices of cooling herbs with warming ones to draw out infection. The blue willow-patterned china cup, her one treasure from her wedding gifts, held willow bark tea that she spooned between his lips whenever he would take it. His hands, Mary observed during a quiet moment, studying McBride's fingers in the lamplight. Soft like risen bread dough, not like Papa's hands. "Different work makes different hands," Sarah replied, noting the callus from holding a pen, the ink stains in the creases. "This man works with papers and words, not rope and iron." The fever peaked near midnight. McBride shook so violently that Joseph had to throw his whole weight across the man's legs. Sweat poured from him like summer rain, soaking the army blanket beneath him. Sarah knew this was the crisis he would break through to healing or slip away to join his ancestors. She reached for the most powerful medicine in her bundle, a small vial of oil pressed from sacred datura seeds. Dangerous if used wrong, life-saving if used right. 3 drops on his tongue, no more. The shaking intensified, then suddenly stopped. McBride's breathing deepened. The terrible heat began to ease. "He's going to live," Joseph said, wonder in his voice. "Perhaps," Sarah replied, but she felt it too, the shift in the room's air, the sense of a spirit choosing to stay rather than depart. Mary. Fresh water. Cool, but not cold. Through the remaining hours until dawn, she kept vigil. She bathed his face and chest with cool cloths, applied fresh poultices, spooned tea between his lips. The children dozed fitfully, curled together on the floor like puppies, but woke instantly whenever she needed them, as the first light touched the eastern mountains. Thomas McBride's fever broke completely. His breathing eased into natural sleep, the kind that heals rather than threatens. Sarah felt the exhaustion of the night settle into her bones, but satisfaction came with it. She had fought death for this stranger and won. Whatever consequences came from saving a white rancher's life, she had kept her oath to heal. The old medicines had proved their power once again, and her children had witnessed that hatred need not be the only currency between their peoples. "Mama," Mary said softly, "look." McBride's eyes had opened blue as winter sky, clear and aware, fixed on Sarah's face with an expression of profound confusion and something that might have been awe. "Where?" His voice came out as barely a whisper. "Who are you?" Sarah straightened, dignity wrapping around her exhaustion like a shawl. "I am Sarah Littlefeather. You are in my home. You are safe." He tried to speak again, but she pressed a finger to his lips. "Rest now. Questions later. You've traveled close to death's door. It will take time to find your way fully back." As she stood to leave him to sleep, his hand caught hers weakly, but with intent. His eyes held a question he couldn't voice. "Why?" she answered for him. "Because it was right." She left him then, taking her children to the main room where breakfast needed making and life needed continuing. Behind them, Thomas McBride lay in a native woman's healing room, surrounded by the scent of sage and old medicine, alive when he should be dead, saved by hands his people had tried to destroy. The sun rose fully, painting the desert gold and red. A new day had begun, carrying possibilities none of them could yet imagine. Thomas McBride woke to a ceiling he didn't recognize, ocotillo ribs laid in careful pattern, sealed with mud that had dried to the color of burnt orange. Panic flickered through him before memory returned in fragments: the ambush at Skeleton Ridge, the desperate ride, falling from his horse. Then, Nothing until now. He tried to sit up, gasping as fire shot along his ribs. Gentle hands pressed him back down. Slowly, a woman's voice said. You've been 3 days in fever. Your body needs time to remember how to move. His eyes focused on her face, strong features. Skin the color of polished cedar. Eyes deep brown and steady as earth itself. Sarah Littlefeather. The name surfaced from his fever dreams along with the impossible truth that this native woman had saved his life. Water, he managed to croak. A young girl appeared in the doorway, maybe 8 years old, carrying a gourd dipper with both hands like it held liquid gold. She approached shyly, dark eyes wide with curiosity. Thomas tried to take the dipper, but his hands shook too badly. Let me, Sarah said, supporting his head while bringing the water to his lips. It tasted of minerals and distance, drawn from deep wells, nothing like the water piped to his ranch house. Somehow, it tasted more real. Thank you, he said when he could speak again. The words felt insufficient. Your children. They helped too. Mary brought the water. Joseph helped carry you. Sarah set the dipper aside. You spoke much in your fever. Thomas felt his chest tighten. What had he said? What secrets had spilled from his unguarded lips? About the courthouse fire, she continued, watching his face. About land deeds. About someone named Hancock. A boy appeared beside his sister, taller, perhaps 12, with his mother's strong features and eyes that held too much knowledge for his years. This would be Joseph, and Thomas could see the protective stance, the hand that rested near the knife at his belt. A boy forced to become a man too soon. The fire, Thomas said carefully, destroyed many records, only the native land claims. Strangely enough, the white settlers' papers survived. Not strange at all, Joseph said, his young voice carrying bitter understanding. Papa knew it was planned. He tried to file new copies, but they said without the originals. Your father, Thomas began, then stopped. He knew the name Samuel Littlefeather, knew the story though he'd tried not to hear it, shot in a dispute over water rights 2 winters past. The official report called it self-defense. The truth, whispered in saloons and stable yards, was murder plain and simple. He died defending what was ours by law, Sarah said simply. The spring on our eastern boundary, where our people have drawn water for 7 generations. Thomas closed his eyes. That spring now watered Josiah Hancock's cattle, the same Hancock who'd organized the ambush at Skeleton Ridge. I need to tell you something, he said, about why they tried to kill me. Sarah brought him a bowl, her best china. He could tell by how carefully she held it. Cornmeal porridge with a touch of molasses. Simple food that tasted better than any feast at his ranch. She and the children sat on the floor nearby, sharing from wooden bowls, and he realized with shame that he'd eaten from their best while they made do with less. Before my father died, Thomas began between careful spoonfuls. He made copies of every survey map, every deed, every water rights claim in the county. He didn't trust the courthouse, said too many papers had a way of disappearing. I have them all in my safe, including the original Littlefeather grant from the Spanish crown, dated 1782. Joseph's spoon clattered to the floor. Sarah's intake of breath was sharp as winter wind. You have our papers, Joseph asked, voice cracking with emotion. Your papers and those of 12 other native families, all legitimate, all predating any white claims. Thomas set down the bowl, exhausted by even this small effort. I was riding to Fort Sumner to file federal copies when Hancock's men ambushed me. He must have learned what I was planning. Why? Sarah asked. Why would you risk your life for our claims? Thomas was quiet for a long moment, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight through the window. My father came to this territory with nothing but determination. He built his ranch through honest work and fair dealing. He taught me that the land doesn't belong to us, we belong to it. And theft is theft, whether done with a gun or a pen. Mary had crept closer. fascinated by this strange white man who spoke of honor and justice. "Your house is very big," she said suddenly. Joseph saw it once from the ridge. "Why do you live there all alone?" "Mary," Sarah scolded. But Thomas held up a trembling hand. "It's a fair question," he said to the child, then found himself speaking truth he'd never voiced aloud. "I suppose I've been hiding. My wife died of fever 6 years ago. Our baby with her. After that, the house felt too large, too empty. I threw myself into the ranch work and stopped seeing people. Stopped seeing what was happening around me." "Grief makes us blind sometimes," Sarah said softly. "But you saw enough to try to help. Too late, perhaps. Hancock has Judge Martinez in his pocket. The territorial government—" "Is not the federal government," Joseph interrupted, his young face alight with hope. "You said Fort Sumner, the federal marshal there. He would have to act on proper documents, wouldn't he?" Thomas studied the boy with new respect. "You know law. Papa taught me to read. I study every law book I can find. Someday." Joseph's voice trailed off, dreams too large for words. "Someday you'll be a lawyer," Thomas said firmly. "If we can prove the original claims, if we can get federal recognition." He tried to sit up again, urgency overcoming weakness. "How long have I been here? Hancock will be wondering." "Let him wonder," Sarah said. "Your horse returned to your ranch 2 days ago. Joseph made sure of that. If Hancock thinks you're dead, we have advantage." Thomas looked at this woman who'd saved his life, who spoke of strategy when she had every reason to want nothing to do with white men's schemes. "Why trust me? Your husband trusted white man's law and died for it." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her fingers tracing the pattern on the china bowl. "In my fever dreams, not fever, but the dreams that come in the deep times of healing work, I saw a chance for something different. Not native against white, but law against lawlessness, justice against theft." She met his eyes directly. "You could have lived quietly on your ranch, safe in your privilege. Instead, you chose to act. That choice nearly killed you. And your choice to save me could bring Hancock's anger on your family." "Perhaps," Sarah said. "Or perhaps it brings the ally we need to save not just our land, but all the families who've been pushed off theirs." Thomas felt something shift in his chest that had nothing to do with his wound. For 6 years he'd lived in isolation, telling himself the ranch was enough, that he needed no one. Now, in this simple adobe room with these 3 people who had every reason to hate him, he felt more at home than he had in his grand house. "When I'm strong enough," he said, "I'll go to Fort Sumner, but not alone. Joseph should come to learn, to witness, to speak for your people." The boy's eyes went wide. Sarah started to protest, but Thomas continued. "He needs to see how law can work when it's properly applied. And the federal marshal needs to see that this isn't about white saving native, but about citizens demanding justice." He looked at Sarah. "With your permission." "Of course." Sarah looked at her son, saw the hope and determination there, the echo of his father's passion for justice, but perhaps with a chance for a different ending. "We'll see. First, you heal. Then we plan. Justice has waited this long, it can wait until you can ride without falling off your horse." Mary giggled at that, the sound bright as morning birds. Even Joseph smiled. Thomas found himself smiling too, despite the pain in his ribs. Outside, the desert wind picked up, rattling the wooden shutters. But inside the small adobe room, something new was taking root, fragile as a desert flower, but with the potential to bloom into something that could change the territory forever. 2 weeks had passed since Thomas McBride had arrived at death's door. Now he could sit up without help, walk to the doorway to watch the desert sunrise, and had begun to feel the restlessness that comes when healing bodies remember their strength. Sarah wouldn't let him ride yet, the wound still tender, the risk of tearing it open too great, but she allowed him to help with small tasks. This morning, he sat at Sarah's clean-swept table, writing carefully with a steel-nib pen he'd asked Joseph to fetch from his saddlebags. The boy watched with fascination as Thomas mixed ink from powder, the blue-black liquid coming to life in the small glass well. "Your penmanship is fine," Joseph observed, "like the documents at the courthouse, but clearer." "My father insisted on it," Thomas replied, finishing a line of careful script. "He said a man's writing should be as clear as his word." He set down the pen. "Joseph, bring me the leather map case from my bags. It's time you understood what we're fighting." Sarah looked up from her weaving, where Mary sat beside her learning to work the heddles. "You're certain you want to involve them in this?" "They're already involved. Your husband saw to that when he stood for truth." Thomas met her steady gaze. "Better they understand the game being played than remain ignorant of its rules." Joseph returned with the oilcloth-wrapped case, handling it like scripture. Thomas spread the largest map on the floor where the morning light streamed brightest. The parchment was thick, official, covered with surveyor's notations and sealed with federal stamps. "This is the original federal survey from 1851, Thomas explained, kneeling beside it despite his protesting ribs. "See this line here? That's the eastern boundary of the Little Feather Grant. And this blue marking, that's your spring." Joseph traced the line with his finger, reading the measurements aloud. 328 chains from the corner marker, bearing north-northwest, to the spring known as Ojo Sagrado. He looked up. "That puts it 2 miles inside our boundary. Not on the edge where Hancock claims." "Exactly." Thomas pulled out another map, newer, with different lines. "This is what's filed at the courthouse now. See the difference?" Sarah had come to look, Mary peering around her mother's skirts. "They moved the boundary," Sarah said quietly. "Made it look like the spring was always on what's now Hancock's land." "But how?" Joseph asked. "The markers, the surveys." "Easy enough to move markers in the desert," Thomas said bitterly. "A few men, a dark night, and suddenly that pile of rocks is 300 yards east of where it should be, without the original maps to prove otherwise." "But you have the originals." "I have copies of the originals, certified by my father when he was territorial administrator. They'll hold up in federal court. But we need more." Thomas shifted, wincing at the pull on his wound. "Sarah, your husband, did he keep anything? Any documentation?" Sarah was quiet for a long moment, then rose and went to the corner where her loom stood. She lifted a loose floorboard beneath it, revealing a wrapped bundle. "Samuel was no fool," she said, bringing the bundle to the table. "He knew papers could burn, be stolen, be lost." She unwrapped layer after layer of oiled leather to reveal a collection of documents. "These are copies he made himself, but more than that. Witness statements. Photos from the federal surveyor's visit in 1876, and this." She held up a leather journal, its pages yellow with age. "The diary of Father Miguel Cordova, who established the mission here in 1794. He describes every boundary marker, every water source, every sacred site." She handed it to Thomas. "It's in Spanish, but—" "I read Spanish," Thomas said, opening the journal carefully. His eyes widened as he scanned the precise handwriting. This is extraordinary. He gives compass bearings, astronomical observations. No court could dispute this. Papa spent 2 years gathering evidence," Joseph said proudly. "He said law was our only weapon against theft." "He was right," Thomas said. "Violence only gives them excuse to take more. But this is proof they can't ignore." He looked at the boy. "You want to learn law? Then learn this. Evidence is everything. Facts, properly documented, are more powerful than any gun." They spent the afternoon going through documents, Thomas teaching Joseph to read survey marks, understand legal descriptions, recognize official seals from forgeries. Mary, bored with the papers, began singing softly as she helped her mother prepare dinner, old songs in the native tongue that seemed to carry the rhythm of the land itself. "That's beautiful," Thomas said, pausing in his instruction. "What do the words mean?" "It tells of the first people finding water here," Sarah translated. "How the spring was a gift from the spirits, to be protected and shared, never owned, The Spanish understood that. Partly, Thomas said. Their grants included water rights that couldn't be separated from the land. It's American law that tries to divide what can't be divided. As the sun lowered toward the western mesas, they moved outside to the cooking fire. Thomas had grown to love these evening hours, when the desert cooled and the sky painted itself in impossible colors. Tonight, Sarah made fry bread while Joseph turned rabbit on a spit, the smell mixing with piñon smoke. "Tell us about Fort Sumner," Joseph asked. "About the federal marshal." Thomas considered his words carefully. "Marshal McKenna is an honest man, which makes him rare in this territory. He's also Irish, which means he has no love for those who steal land from people who were here first. His own family was pushed off their farm in Ireland." "Will he act on our evidence?" "If presented properly, yes. But we need more than paper. We need testimony from the families affected. We need to show a pattern of theft, not isolated incidents." Sarah served the food on tin plates, save for Thomas, who again received the china. He'd tried to refuse the honor, but she'd insisted with a look that brooked no argument. 12 families, you said," Sarah mused. 12 families with legitimate claims. If we could unite them, Hancock would know immediately. Thomas warned. "He has eyes everywhere. The moment people start gathering, talking, he'll act." "Then we work quietly, Boris," Joseph suggested. "One family at a time. I could carry messages no one notices a native boy." "Too dangerous," Sarah said immediately. "Less dangerous than doing nothing," Joseph countered with his father's stubborn jaw. Thomas watched the family debate, feeling both outsider and participant. The fire crackled between them, sending sparks toward the first stars. In his grand house, he ate alone at a table that could seat 20. Here, seated on the ground with a tin plate balanced on his knee, he felt more nourished than he had in years. "There's something else, he said when the debate quieted. "My ride to Fort Sumner, it wasn't just about filing papers. I'd received word that a federal investigation is beginning. The Department of Interior has noticed irregularities in territorial land transfers. They're sending investigators." Sarah's eyes sharpened. Within the month, supposedly, if we could have our evidence ready, testimonies gathered, we could present it all at once," Joseph finished, excitement lighting his young face. "Too much for them to ignore or cover up." "It's still dangerous," Sarah warned. "Hancock has killed for less than this." Thomas met her eyes across the fire. "He's already tried to kill me, and he succeeded with your husband. How many more will he destroy if we do nothing?" Sarah was quiet, looking at her children. Mary had fallen asleep against her side, peaceful and trusting. Joseph sat straight, his face showing the man he would become, fierce with purpose, tempered by his mother's wisdom. "We can't live forever in fear," she finally said. "Samuel wouldn't want that. He'd want us to finish what he started." "Then we will," Thomas said simply. Together, as the fire died to embers, they planned. Joseph would begin carefully approaching other affected families. Thomas would organize the documentation, create a legal framework that even territorial corruption couldn't break. Sarah would use her standing as a healer, trusted by all, to build consensus. Later, as Sarah helped Thomas back to his room, he still tired too easily. Though he tried to hide it, she paused in the doorway. "Why?" she asked. "Really, why not the noble reasons you give, Joseph? But the truth." Thomas considered lying, giving her the easy answer. But she deserved honesty. "Because for 6 years I've been dead inside, going through motions, existing but not living. Your family, what you've shown me, it's like water in the desert. I'd forgotten people could be good to each other without expecting payment." Sarah's expression softened. "You're a strange man, Thomas McBride." "Is that bad?" "Different isn't always bad. Sometimes it's just necessary." She touched his shoulder gently, checking the bandage one more time. "Rest now. Tomorrow we begin to fight back. But tonight, heal." As she left, Thomas lay in the narrow bed, staring at the Ocotillo ceiling, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Somewhere a coyote called. Closer. He could hear Sarah singing Mary to sleep, the melody ancient and comforting. For the first time in 6 years, he didn't feel alone. A month had turned the desert from late spring to early summer, and with it, Thomas McBride had transformed from patient to participant in the daily rhythm of the Little Feather household. His wound had closed to a pink scar, still tender, but no longer limiting. Sarah had finally declared him fit for light work, though she watched him carefully for signs of overexertion. This morning, Thomas stood with Joseph in the small corral, examining the damage from last week's flash flood. The water had come down from the mountains like a wall, taking out 20 feet of fence and scattering the chicken coop Sarah had built with her late husband. "We'll need new posts," Thomas said, running his hand along a cracked cedar pole. "This one's split clear through. There's good juniper up the canyon," Joseph offered. "Papa and I cut from there. Then we'll go together. But first," Thomas gestured to his horse, which Joseph had been caring for these weeks. "Time you learned to saddle properly. Not just throwing leather on, but understanding why each piece matters." Joseph's eyes lit up. He'd been borrowing horses when needed, riding bareback mostly. But Thomas's saddle was a work of art, tooled leather with silver conchos, worth more than many families saw in a year. "First, the blanket," Thomas instructed, spreading the woven wool carefully. "Feel here no wrinkles, no fold that could rub a sore. A horse with a back sore is useless and suffering both." Joseph's hands followed Thomas's, learning the smooth motion. "Why do you care so much? It's just a horse." "Never just a horse." Thomas's voice carried memory. "My father taught me that how a man treats his animals shows his true character. Cruelty to something dependent on you is the worst kind of cowardice." They worked through each step: the positioning of the saddle, the careful tightening of the cinch, the adjustment of stirrups. Joseph absorbed every detail with the focused intensity he brought to his law books. "Your turn," Thomas said, stepping back. "Take it all off and start again." While Joseph practiced, Sarah emerged from the house with Mary, carrying water jars to the garden. Thomas found himself watching her move, economical, graceful despite the hard work. She'd tied her hair back with a strip of calico, and the morning sun caught the silver threads that had come early from grief and hardship. "You're staring," Mary announced, having appeared at his elbow like a small ghost. Thomas felt heat rise to his face. "I was thinking about Mama. She's pretty when she smiles. She smiles more since you came." Before Thomas could respond, Mary had darted away to help with the water, but her words lodged in his chest like seeds finding soil. The morning progressed with work. Thomas and Joseph rode up the canyon, Joseph proud on the properly saddled horse, and selected good straight juniper for posts. Thomas showed him how to read the grain, to spot wood that would last versus wood that would rot within a season. "My father and I did this," Thomas found himself saying as they worked the two-man saw. "Every summer, we'd cut posts for the winter's repairs. He'd tell stories while we worked about Scotland, about coming to America with nothing." "What happened to him?" Joseph asked, pulling his end of the saw. "Heart gave out 3 years ago, died at his desk, pen in hand, writing instructions for the spring roundup." Thomas smiled at the memory. "Said he'd rather die working than waste away in bed." They hauled the posts back by noon, the sun already fierce. Sarah had lunch waiting: beans with peppers, fresh tortillas, cool water flavored with mint from the creek. Thomas noticed she'd set his place with the china again, despite his protests. "You're a guest," she said firmly when he mentioned it. "After a month, I'm furniture by now." That earned him one of her rare smiles, the kind that transformed her serious face into something luminous. Mary had been right, Sarah did smile more now. The afternoon brought different work. The chicken coop needed rebuilding, and Thomas attacked it with enthusiasm. He'd always been good with his hands, despite his father's push toward education and ledgers. There was satisfaction in making something solid, useful. "Hold this board," he told Joseph, positioning a crosspiece. See how the angle matters. Too steep and rain pools, too flat and it won't drain. Sarah worked nearby, mixing lye soap in the great iron pot, the sharp smell of ash and fat cutting through the desert air. Mary helped, stirring carefully with a long paddle while her mother added ingredients with practiced precision. Don't let it splash, Sarah warned. Lye will burn through skin quicker than fire. Thomas found himself drawn into their world completely, the small jokes, the shared labor, the comfortable silences. When the soap was done and cooling in wooden molds, Sarah retreated to her loom while Mary practiced spinning wool on a drop spindle her grandmother had made. The late afternoon light slanted gold through the door as Thomas sat on the packed earth floor, his back against the wall, working on a piece of torn harness. Joseph sat beside him, watching intently as Thomas's fingers worked the thick harness all through the leather. The trick, Thomas explained, is to follow the old holes when you can. Leather remembers where it's been pierced. Fight that memory and you'll have weak spots. He guided Joseph's hands, showing him how to pull the waxed thread tight, but not too tight. How to lock each stitch so it wouldn't pull free under strain. Joseph's first attempts were clumsy, but his determination was fierce. "Why didn't you have children?" the boy asked suddenly. "You'd have been a good father." Thomas's hands stilled. Across the room, Sarah's shuttle paused in its rhythm. "We tried," Thomas said quietly. "My wife, Elizabeth, she carried 3 babies. None lived past birth. The last one took her with him." He focused on the leather, making another precise hole. "After that, I couldn't see the point of the ranch, the land, any of it. What good is building something with no one to leave it to?" "You could marry again," Mary piped up from her spinning. "Mama's still young enough for babies." "Mary." Sarah's mortification was complete. "Go check the garden, now." The girl scampered out, but her words hung in the air like smoke. Thomas kept his eyes on his work, aware of the heat in his face, aware of Sarah's stillness at the loom. Joseph, with the wisdom to know when silence was needed, focused intently on his stitching. The quiet stretched, filled only by the whisper of thread through leather and the soft sound of Sarah's resumed weaving. As sunset approached, they moved outside for the evening meal. Thomas had repaired 2 bridles, a set of reins, and started teaching Joseph how to braid a new lead rope. His fingers ached pleasantly from the work, a different ache than the ledger cramp he knew so well. Sarah had made something special, rabbit stew with early squash from the garden, flavored with wild herbs Thomas couldn't identify, but that tasted of the land itself. The sourdough starter she'd maintained for years had produced bread with perfect crust, which they used to soak up the rich gravy. "I've been thinking," Thomas said as they ate, "about the other families, the ones who lost land. If we could offer them work, temporary, on my ranch." "They won't take charity," Sarah said immediately. "Not charity, real work. I need hands for the summer drives, fence repairs, well digging. If they happen to be there when the federal investigators arrive, if they happen to have their documents with them." Sarah considered this. Her spoon paused halfway to her mouth. It could work. Pride intact, families fed, and witnesses gathered. "You're learning to think like us. Is that an insult or compliment?" "Both. Maybe." But she smiled as she said it. After dinner, as had become their custom, they sat by the dying fire. Sarah worked on mending clothes while Thomas whittled tonight, a small horse for Mary's doll. Joseph read from one of Thomas's law books by firelight, occasionally asking for clarification on a term or concept. "This part about water rights," Joseph said. "It says first use establishes primary claim. Our people were using that spring for 7 generations before any white settler arrived." "That's federal law," Thomas confirmed, his knife making delicate cuts in the soft pine. "Territorial law tries to override it, but federal law is supreme. That's why we need federal intervention." "Will they really come, the investigators?" "If we make enough noise, yes. The Department of Interior doesn't like being embarrassed, and land fraud on this scale, if proven, would be a scandal reaching Washington. Sarah looked up from her sewing. And if Hancock learns what we're doing before they arrive. Thomas met her eyes across the fire. Then we'd better be ready for whatever he tries. You could leave, she said quietly. Go back to your ranch. Claim you were hurt in a fall. Know nothing about any of this. You'd be safe. Would I? Thomas set down his whittling. The little horse nearly complete. Safe in my big empty house, knowing what I know. That's not safety. Sarah, that's just another kind of death. She held his gaze for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them. Joseph, wise beyond his years, announced he was tired and headed inside. Mary had long since fallen asleep in her mother's lap. I should put her to bed, Sarah said, but didn't move. Sarah, Thomas began, then stopped. What could he say? That this month had shown him what living meant, that her smile had become necessary as water, that the thought of returning to his empty house filled him with dread deeper than any wound. I know, she said softly. I know what you're thinking. But Thomas, we're from different worlds. My husband died trying to bridge those worlds. Your husband died because men like Hancock make those worlds enemies. It doesn't have to be that way. Doesn't it? Look around this territory. How many native women with white husbands are treated as equals? How many are just possessions, conveniences, discarded when no longer useful? Thomas stood, moved by an impulse he couldn't name. He knelt beside her, careful not to touch, but close enough to speak without the fire between them. I'm not asking for anything, Sarah. I'm just grateful for this time, for your trust, for showing me that emptiness isn't the only way to honor the dead. He gestured to the sleeping child, the adobe walls that held such unexpected warmth. This is what Elizabeth would have wanted for me, not the grieving, but the living after. Sarah's hand moved, perhaps involuntarily, to rest on his where it lay on his knee. The touch was light as a butterfly, there and then gone, but it burned through him like lightning. We should sleep, she said. Tomorrow we start contacting the other families. The real work begins. As she carried Mary inside, Thomas remained by the dying fire, looking up at stars that seemed closer here than at his ranch. The little wooden horse was finished in his pocket, smooth and perfect, waiting to make a child smile. Inside the house, he could hear Sarah singing Mary to sleep, the ancient melody carrying on the night air. Tomorrow would bring danger, planning, the careful dance of resistance. But tonight, he'd shared simple work and quiet evening with people who'd become necessary to him. His hands smelled of leather and lye soap, honest work instead of ink and paper. His back ached from building and hauling instead of hunching over ledgers. He'd never been happier. The riders came with the dawn, their dust cloud visible from the ridge long before the sound of hooves reached the Little Feather homestead. Sarah saw them first, pausing in her morning water drawing to shade her eyes against the rising sun. 3 men in a wagon, another on horseback alongside. Joseph, she called quietly, but her son was already moving, having learned to read his mother's tone. Take Mary to gather eggs. Stay by the far side of the coop. Thomas emerged from the lean-to where he'd been checking his saddle, planning the day's ride to contact the Rivera family. He recognized the lead rider's gray mare before he recognized the man Josiah Hancock, his starched collar white as bone against his black coat despite the dust of travel. Get inside, Thomas said low to Sarah. This is my land. I stand on it. Her chin lifted in that way he'd come to know meant no argument would move her. Thomas positioned himself slightly behind and to her left, present but not prominent, letting her hold the authority of ownership. The wagon rolled to a stop 20 feet from the house. Hancock dismounted with the careful movements of a man who preferred chairs to saddles. The 2 men in the wagon stayed seated, but Thomas noted how one kept his hand near his coat armed. Then, the driver held a leather portfolio thick with papers. Mrs. Littlefeather. Hancock touched his hat brim with mocking courtesy. Fine morning. Mr. Hancock. Sarah's voice held steady as bedrock. You're far from the courthouse. County business brings me out. Hancock's pale eyes swept the homestead, lingering on the repaired chicken coop, the new fence posts. I see you've made improvements. That's good. Increases value. The value of land that's been in my family for 7 generations doesn't need your assessment. Hancock smiled, the expression never reaching his eyes. About that, there have been questions raised about the legitimacy of certain land claims. The territorial government is offering to purchase questionable holdings at fair price, save folks the trouble of lengthy legal battles they can't afford. The man in the wagon opened the portfolio, producing papers covered in official-looking seals. The morning sun caught on the brass embosser he held, the kind used to make documents appear legal. $10 an acre, Hancock continued. Cash money. More than enough to relocate somewhere. Suitable. $10? Joseph had appeared despite his mother's instructions, his young voice cracking with outrage. This land is worth 50 an acre, with water rights double that. Hancock's attention shifted to the boy. Smart child. Shame if his education was interrupted by unfortunate circumstances. The threat hung in the air like smoke. Sarah's hand found Joseph's shoulder, whether to comfort or restrain. Thomas couldn't tell. The thing about education, Thomas said, stepping forward into Hancock's line of sight, is that it teaches you to read documents carefully. Hancock went rigid. His hand twitched toward the pearl-handled derringer Thomas knew he carried in his vest pocket. McBride, heard you had an accident. Disappointed. Concerned. Naturally. A man of your standing. Riding alone. Taking foolish risks. Hancock's recovery was quick, the practiced smoothness of a career manipulator. Didn't know you were acquainted with Mrs. Littlefeather. Mrs. Littlefeather was kind enough to offer aid when my horse threw me. I've been recuperating, helping with repairs in exchange for her hospitality. How charitable. Hancock's eyes narrowed, calculating. Your ranch must be suffering without you. My foreman's capable. Besides, I've found the time here educational. Mrs. Littlefeather has been showing me the original boundary markers, the ones from the Spanish grant. Sarah caught on immediately. Mr. McBride has been kind enough to verify our surveys against his father's records from his time as territorial administrator. Those records burned in the courthouse fire, Hancock said too quickly. The courthouse copies did. Thomas agreed mildly. Good thing my father kept duplicates in his personal files. Habit from his army days, never trust a single supply line. The silence stretched taut. One of the men in the wagon shifted, leather creaking. Hancock's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. Speaking of documents, Thomas continued, I've been reviewing territorial law regarding land transfers. Interesting provisions about duress and coercion. Sales made under threat are legally void, with triple damages owed. No one's threatening anyone. Hancock's voice had lost its smooth edge. Good. Then Mrs. Littlefeather's refusal of your generous offer won't result in any unfortunate circumstances for her or her children. Hancock took a step forward. Thomas didn't move, but something in his stance changed, a settling of weight that spoke of readiness. He might be a rancher who worked with papers more than pistols, but he'd grown up in this territory when it was rougher, and that knowledge lived in his bones. You're making a mistake, McBride, aligning yourself with losing causes. The only mistake I made was not paying attention sooner. Thomas pulled a small notebook from his pocket, the kind surveyors used. Should I record this visit for my report to the federal investigators? Date, time, and persons present, nature of offer made? Federal investigators. Didn't you know the Department of Interior is very interested in the irregularities in territorial land transfers? Something about missing documents, altered surveys, suspicious fires. Thomas made a note with his pencil. I'm sure they'll want to know about cash offers for land at 20% of value. Hancock's face had gone the color of old ash. The man with the portfolio started closing it, eager to leave. "This isn't over," Hancock said. "No," Thomas agreed. "It's just beginning. But I suggest you conduct future county business through proper channels. Mrs. Littlefeather has legal representation now. You're not a lawyer." "No, but I know several, including the federal prosecutor in Santa Fe. We served together in the territorial legislature. I'm sure he'd be fascinated by the pattern of land transfers you've orchestrated." Hancock turned to Sarah, ignoring Thomas entirely. "You're making a mistake, woman. This offer won't come again." Sarah stepped forward, her dignity wrapping around her like armor. "My husband made the mistake of believing men like you could be reasoned with. I won't repeat that error. Get off my land." "Your land for now. Forever," Joseph said fiercely, moving to stand beside his mother. Hancock looked at the three of them, the native woman who wouldn't bow, the boy with fire in his eyes, the white rancher who'd chosen a side. His hand twitched again toward his vest, then fell. "We're done here," he told his men. As he mounted his horse, he looked back at Thomas. "McBride, folks in town are wondering about you. Spending time out here, away from your own kind." "My kind," Thomas said evenly, "are people who believe in justice." The wagon turned, dust rising as it departed. They watched until it disappeared over the ridge, none of them moving, as if stillness could hold danger at bay. Mary crept out from behind the chicken coop where she'd been hiding despite instructions. She ran to her mother, burying her face in Sarah's skirts. "They're gone, little one," Sarah murmured, but her eyes stayed on the horizon. "They'll be back," Joseph said. "Not if we move first." Thomas turned to Sarah. "We need to accelerate our plans. Contact all the families. Gather the documents. Get word to Santa Fe." "That's 12 families scattered across 40 miles of desert," Sarah pointed out. "It would take weeks. Not if we divide the task." Thomas pulled out his notebook again, this time sketching a rough map. "Joseph knows the northern families. I can reach the southern ones. You have the trust needed for the ones in between. It's dangerous to separate. It's dangerous to wait." Thomas met her worried gaze. "Hancock's desperate enough to come here personally. That means he knows federal attention is coming. We need our evidence ready before he can destroy it or the witnesses." Sarah was quiet for a moment, her hand still soothing Mary's hair. "Tonight, then." "We plan tonight. Ride tomorrow." The day passed in preparation. Thomas wrote letters of introduction, carefully worded to avoid suspicion if intercepted. Sarah prepared traveling food jerky, dried fruit, cornmeal that could be mixed with water for quick meals. Joseph studied his father's maps, memorizing routes and alternate paths. As evening fell, they gathered around Sarah's table, the maps spread between them, candles casting flickering light. The leather portfolio of documents sat open, each piece a weapon against theft. "The Riveras first," Sarah said, tracing a route with her finger. "They lost their southern pastures last year. Maria Rivera is my cousin, she'll listen." "The Chavez family still has their original grant from 1769, Thomas added. "If we can get Pablo Chavez to show that in federal court." "He's afraid," Joseph said. "His brother was shot for less." "Fear is what Hancock counts on," Thomas replied. "But together, with federal backing, we become too big to silence." When they planned through the night, considering every family, every document, every possible danger. Mary fell asleep at the table, her head on her arms. Sarah covered her with a shawl but didn't move her, keeping her children close after the morning's threat. "There's something else," Thomas said as the candles burned low. "My ranch. If the families need sanctuary, somewhere Hancock won't dare attack directly. They can come there." Sarah looked at him sharply. "You'd shelter 12 native families. Your neighbors would." "Let them talk. The ranch has water, defensible positions, and enough supplies to sustain everyone for months if needed." He paused, then added quietly, "It's time that land served justice instead of just prosperity." "You could lose everything," Sarah said. "Your standing, your connections, maybe the ranch itself." Then I lose it for something worthwhile. Thomas rolled up the maps carefully. My father built that ranch to be a legacy. What better legacy than standing for what's right? Sarah reached across the table, her hand covering his briefly. Samuel would have liked you. I hope I prove worthy of that. Joseph had been quiet, but now he spoke. When this is over, when we win, what then? Thomas looked at the boy, seeing the man he would become, educated, fierce with purpose, bridge between two worlds. Then we make sure it never happens again. We establish precedents, create laws that protect everyone's rights. He smiled slightly. Maybe by then you'll be ready to take the bar examination. A native lawyer, Joseph said, wonder in his voice. Why not? The law should belong to everyone. As they prepared for sleep, Thomas stood outside, looking at the stars. Tomorrow would begin a dangerous journey, but tonight had shown him something precious, the power of people united by purpose rather than divided by difference. Sarah joined him, standing close but not touching. Are you ready for this? I've been ready since the day I woke up in your home and saw what I'd been blind to. And after, when the fight is won or lost. Thomas turned to her, seeing moonlight catch in her dark eyes. Then I hope to still have a place at your fire. She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. They stood together in the desert night, preparing for war but finding peace in proximity, in shared purpose, in the growing certainty that some battles were worth any risk. 6 months had transformed the valley in ways that went deeper than the spring floods that now ran strong through the creek. Sarah stood at the door of the new schoolhouse, watching Thomas explain water rights to a mixed group of children, native, Mexican, and even a few Anglo ranchers' sons whose fathers had finally accepted that education meant survival in changing times. The doctrine of prior appropriation, Thomas was saying, his voice carrying the patience of someone who'd found his calling, means first in time, first in right. But federal law recognizes something older: Aboriginal use. If your people used the water before any written record existed, that claim supersedes all others. Joseph stood beside him, translating into Spanish and the native tongue when needed, his young face serious with responsibility. At 15, he'd grown tall over the winter, his voice deepening into manhood. The territorial court had appointed him official translator just last month, the youngest ever to hold such a position. Mr. McBride, a small hand shot up. My papa says you gave up your big house to live here. Why? Sarah saw Thomas smile, the expression transforming his face from the stern rancher he'd been to the teacher he'd become. Sometimes. Miguel, a man finds that big houses can be very empty. And sometimes he discovers that home isn't about the size of the walls, but about who shares the space inside them. His eyes found Sarah's across the room, and she felt that familiar warmth bloom in her chest. 6 months since the federal investigators had arrived. 6 months since Josiah Hancock had been arrested for land fraud, his network of corruption unraveling like a poorly woven blanket. 6 months since 12 families had seen their lands restored, their claims validated by federal decree. Mama, look, Mary called from the garden plot beside the school. The 3 sisters are growing. Sarah walked out to where her daughter knelt among the traditional planting corn, beans, and squash intertwined as they'd been grown for countless generations. But alongside them grew tomatoes Thomas had brought from his ranch, peppers from the Rivera family, herbs from the Chavez gardens. The plot was a living testament to what they'd built, not replacement but combination, each tradition making the whole stronger. The beans are climbing high, Sarah observed, touching the vines that wound around the corn stalks. Mr. Thomas says that's symbiotic, Mary pronounced carefully. Each plant helps the others, like our families now. Symbiotic, Sarah corrected gently, but she smiled at the truth in her daughter's words. The morning's lessons concluded with the children spilling out into the sunshine, their voices mixing languages and laughter. Sarah watched Joseph help the younger ones with their letters, patient as his father had been, though with a confidence Samuel had never lived to develop. Thomas approached her, his step easy despite the slight hitch from his old wound that appeared when weather changed. He'd traded his fine wool vests for simple cotton shirts, though he still wore his father's watch chain, a reminder of where he came from, balanced with acceptance of where he was. "The Rivera boys are quick with numbers," he said, stopping beside her. "Pablo thinks his eldest could manage the ranch accounts by next year. Creating your own competition. Creating community." He gazed across the valley where new fences marked restored boundaries, where shared wells served multiple families, where the cooperative they'd formed marketed cattle and crops together for better prices than any could get alone. "My father always said the best business was when everyone prospered. Your father was a wise man." "He was. But I think he'd be surprised to see his son finally understanding what prosperity really means." They walked together toward the creek, passing the spot where the old courthouse had stood. A new one was being built, with federal oversight and walls of stone that wouldn't burn so conveniently. 3 of the 12 families had members serving on the new planning committee, their voices finally part of the official conversation. "I received a letter from Marshal McKenna," Thomas said as they reached the cottonwoods. "The federal prosecutor wants me to testify in Santa Fe about the larger conspiracy. They've found similar patterns in 3 other territories." Sarah felt a familiar tightness in her chest. Every time Thomas left for legal business, she wondered if he'd return, if the pull of his old world would prove stronger than what they'd built here. "When do you leave?" "I don't—" He turned to face her. "I've sent depositions, all the written evidence they need. My place is here now." "Thomas?" "Sarah." "Wait." He took a breath, and she saw something in his expression she'd never seen before. Nervousness. Thomas McBride, who'd faced down Hancock and corruption and federal investigators, was nervous. "I need to speak with Joseph and Mary first," he said. "Will you wait here?" Confused, Sarah nodded. She watched him walk back toward the school where the children were helping clean the classroom. Through the window, she could see him kneel to Mary's height, speaking earnestly. The little girl's face lit up like sunrise, and she threw her arms around his neck. "Joseph," more reserved, listened carefully, then extended his hand for a formal shake before pulling Thomas into an embrace. When Thomas returned, both children flanked him, barely containing grins. "Mrs. Littlefeather," Joseph said formally, though his eyes danced. "Mr. McBride has requested permission to court you properly." "With our blessing," Mary added, bouncing on her toes. Sarah felt her heart stop, then race forward like a spooked horse. "Children, this isn't—" "Mama," Joseph interrupted gently. "Papa would want you happy. He'd want us to have a father again." "And Thomas," the boy looked up at the man beside him. "Thomas has proven himself, not as a white man helping natives, but as a man who stands for justice." "He reads to me every night," Mary added. "And he's teaching me arithmetic. And he fixed my doll. And he makes you smile." Sarah looked at Thomas, who stood quietly, letting the children make his case. But his eyes held everything: hope, patience, love that had grown from gratitude to partnership to something deeper than either had expected to find again. "The community," Sarah began, then stopped. The community had already accepted them. The shared work of resistance had broken down barriers that might have stood for generations. At the harvest celebration last month, she danced with Thomas while the whole valley watched and smiled. "I'm not asking you to give up anything," Thomas said softly. "Not your name, not your traditions, not your independence. I'm asking to join my life to yours, to be Joseph and Mary's father-in-law as I've tried to be in practice, to build something new while honoring everything that came before." Sarah thought of Samuel, of his fierce love for justice, his dreams of education for their children, his vision of a world where respect replaced oppression. Thomas had helped make those dreams real, not from obligation, but from conviction. Samuel would have recognized a kindred spirit. "Mama," Mary tugged at her skirt. "Say yes, please." Sarah knelt, gathering both children close, then looked up at Thomas. "Yes." The word hung in the air like a blessing. Thomas's face transformed with joy that made him look years younger. He reached for her hand, helping her stand, and for a moment they were all connected, a family not of blood but of choice, not of single tradition but of shared purpose. That evening, the whole community gathered at the creek for celebration. It started as acknowledgement of the spring planting, but became something more as news spread. The Rivera family brought guitars. The Chavez clan shared mezcal they'd been saving. Even some Anglo ranchers appeared. Awkward, but trying. Their presence a sign that change, while slow, was possible. Thomas and Sarah stood before Father Miguel, the old priest who'd married her parents, who'd buried Samuel, who'd baptized her children. He spoke words in Spanish, in Latin, in the native tongue, weaving traditions together like Sarah wove her blankets, each thread distinct but creating something whole. "Marriage," Father Miguel said, his ancient voice carrying across the water, "is like this creek, two streams joining, each maintaining its source but flowing stronger together. As the sun set, painting the desert in shades of gold and rose, the community danced. Joseph played his father's violin, an instrument Thomas had helped him repair, the Scottish airs mixing with Mexican ballads and native drums in a music that belonged to no one tradition and therefore to everyone. Later, as the fire burned low and families began drifting home, Thomas and Sarah walked to the great cottonwood where they'd first met. In Thomas's hands were two saplings, their roots wrapped in damp cloth. "From my ranch," he explained. "Cottonwoods I grew from cuttings of the tree that shaded my father's grave." Together they dug in the soft earth near the creek, planting the saplings side by side. Sarah poured water from the spring while Thomas packed earth around the delicate roots. "Some trees grow strongest when their roots intertwine," Thomas said, his hands covered in soil, his wedding ring a simple silver band Sarah had made from Mexican coins catching moonlight. "These will shade our grandchildren one day." Sarah leaned against him, feeling his solid warmth, his steady breathing, the rightness of standing together on this land that had seen so much sorrow but now promised joy. "Our grandchildren," she repeated, tasting the words. "Native and Anglo and everything in between." "Americans," Thomas said simply. "True Americans, born from all who came before." They stood watching the creek flow past, eternal and changing, carrying mountain snow to desert bloom. Behind them, the schoolhouse waited for tomorrow's lessons. Their home, the adobe, expanded now with rooms for Thomas's law books, for Joseph's studies, for Mary's growing collection of dolls from every tradition glowed with lamplight where the children prepared for bed. The land stretched around them, legally secured, communally protected, individually cherished. Not the ending of one story, but the beginning of another, written in languages that were learning to speak together, in traditions that strengthened rather than threatening each other, in love that had grown from suspicion to trust to certainty. "Ready to go home?" Thomas asked. Sarah smiled, taking his earth-stained hand in hers. "We are home." They walked back together through the desert evening, past the garden where three sisters grew with imported vegetables, past the school where all children learned, past the new courthouse where justice would be built on stronger foundations. The cottonwood saplings behind them settled into soil that would nourish them for centuries, their roots already beginning the slow, essential work of intertwining, of becoming something stronger than either could be alone. Thomas McBride arrived at Sarah Littlefeather's door wounded and alone, carrying documents that could restore stolen lands to native families. In saving his life, Sarah didn't just heal a stranger, she awakened a man to his purpose. Thomas's gratitude transformed into something deeper, the recognition that true wealth isn't measured in acres but in connections, that family isn't only blood, but choice, and that justice requires those with privilege to stand with those without. Their story reminds us that gratitude is more than saying thank you, it's allowing ourselves to be changed by kindness received. When Sarah's family welcomed Thomas despite every reason to mistrust, they created space for transformation. When Thomas used his knowledge and standing to fight for their rights, he discovered that defending others filled the emptiness no amount of land could touch. In building their blended family, They prove that our differences can become our strength when we choose connection over isolation, understanding over prejudice, and courage over comfort. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give in return for kindness is to become the person that kindness shows us we can be. Have you ever witnessed systematic injustice like the land theft these families faced, where official power was used to destroy legitimate claims? How did communities come together to resist?